September 18, 1931, is a quiet night along the South Manchuria Railway. At exactly 10:20 in the evening, Lieutenant Tsuomori Kawamoto of the Japanese Imperial Army places a small charge of dynamite next to the steel tracks near the city of Mukden. The resulting explosion is incredibly weak. It barely damages one side of the rail line. In fact, a passenger train passes over the exact spot just minutes later without even slowing down. But physical destruction is not the objective of this operation. The objective is the narrative. Within hours, Japanese military commanders point to the blasted dirt and publicly blame Chinese dissidents for a brazen act of sabotage. By morning, a full-scale, completely unauthorized military invasion of Manchuria is underway. The League of Nations, the premier diplomatic body, built from the ashes of the Great War to prevent another global conflict, launches a slow investigation. They eventually issue the Lytton Report, which offers a hollow reprimand. The League does nothing to reverse the territorial theft. Japan simply walks out of the organization. A major military power has just stress-tested the global security apparatus and realized that the rules of the international order are completely imaginary. The true origin of World War II, what historians get wrong, actually begins right here in the cold dirt of Manchuria, not 8 years later on the plains of Poland. Most people are taught a very clean, sanitized textbook narrative about the Second World War. We are told the conflict started on September 1, 1939, when German tanks rolled across the Polish border. The standard story suggests a madman rose to power in a vacuum. The world tried earnestly but foolishly to appease him, and eventually the forces of democracy had to step in and save humanity. That story is a comforting fiction. It is a highly curated version of history that ignores a deeply broken global system, rampant institutional cowardice, and the dangerous gap between how power claims to work and how it actually operates in reality. The real origins of the deadliest conflict in human history stretch back decades earlier to a humiliated nation stripped bare by vindictive treaties, a sprawling network of corporate profiteers chasing lucrative defense contracts, and elite diplomats who traded away the sovereignty of foreign nations to buy themselves a few more months of political survival. To understand the kinetic action that erupted in 1939, you have to look closely at the systemic economic terminal outcome engineered in 1919. The Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles outside Paris. The victorious powers of the First World War gather not to draft a sustainable peace treaty, but to dictate ruinous terms to a shattered Germany. They draft a massive receipt. Article 231 of the treaty, the infamous War Guilt Clause, forces the German nation to accept total moral and financial responsibility for the entire war. The final bill for reparations is finalized at 132 billion gold marks. It is an astronomical sum deliberately designed not for structural restitution, but for permanent economic destruction. Economist John Maynard Keynes, sitting with the British delegation, recognizes the disastrous math immediately. He resigns his post in disgust, writing fiercely that this vindictive peace will guarantee a future war of vengeance. His warning is completely ignored by politicians desperate to appease their angry voting bases at home. The economic results are immediate and catastrophic. By 1923, the Weimar Republic is paralyzed by a hyperinflation crisis, so severe it breaks the concept of money itself. The printing presses run 24 hours a day just to keep up with the devaluation. A single US dollar, once worth 4 marks, suddenly equals 4.2 trillion marks. A single loaf of bread requires a wheelbarrow full of paper currency. Working-class families burn stacks of cash in their stoves because it is cheaper than buying firewood. Middle-class savings accounts, the financial anchor of any stable democracy, are wiped out overnight. Pensions become entirely worthless. Historian Richard Evans argues that this systemic economic violence fundamentally destroyed the political legitimacy of the democratic Weimar government in the eyes of everyday German citizens. When a population is systematically stripped of its dignity, its savings, and its future, people do not look for moderate parliamentary solutions. They look for someone to blame, and they look for someone who promises a reckoning. The Versailles settlement handed radical demagogues a ready-made, highly potent grievance. The treaty was a societal pressure cooker with the safety valve intentionally welded shut. But political outrage alone cannot build a mechanized army. Outrage needs steel, outrage needs fuel, and outrage needs massive amounts of foreign capital. This brings us to the darkest, most suppressed chapter of the pre-war years, the history buried deep under decades of corporate public relations and classified board minutes. The massive German rearmament program of the 1930s is often framed as a miraculous domestic achievement. In reality, it was bankrolled, equipped, and modernized by a vast network of American and European corporations who quietly kept the authoritarian war machine running while their own democratic governments looked the other way. Historian Anthony Sutton details extensively how Wall Street financial firms poured millions of dollars in loans into massive German cartels like IG Farben and Vereinigte Stahlwerke during the 1920s under the Dawes and Young plans. When the political winds shifted radically in 1933, the foreign money did not stop flowing. It simply adapted to the new management. Take the logistical nightmare of petroleum. A modern mechanized blitzkrieg requires massive amounts of fuel, specifically high-octane aviation gas for bombers and fighters. Germany possessed virtually no domestic crude oil reserves. They relied heavily on expensive synthetic fuel processes, developed by the chemical giant IG Farben. But to make their planes fly at combat performance levels, they desperately needed a specific chemical additive called tetraethyl lead. Standard Oil of New Jersey, an American corporate titan, entered into joint ventures with IG Farben to supply this exact critical technology. Without this specific chemical transfer, the Luftwaffe could not have achieved the air superiority necessary to terrorize Europe. Then there is the issue of raw logistics and data management. Historian Edwin Black has exhaustively documented how the rapid, terrifying expansion of the German state apparatus was technologically supported by foreign entities. From aggressive census operations that identified minority populations to the chilling logistical efficiency of the regime's eventual terminal outcomes, the data was organized using advanced punch card technology supplied by an American subsidiary of IBM. The corporate profit motive consistently superseded any concept of geopolitics or human rights. Executives sitting in comfortable mahogany boardrooms in New York, London, and Paris authorized joint ventures, technology transfers, and massive financial loans to a foreign regime that was explicitly promising a war of conquest. Automotive giants, like General Motors, through its Opel subsidiary and Ford Motor Company, built massive factories on German soil that produced the trucks and transport vehicles that would soon carry invading armies across European borders. Henry Ford himself received the Grand Cross of the German Eagle in 1938, the highest honor the regime could bestow on a foreigner. These businessmen calculated the financial risk, saw the massive return on investment, and signed the production contracts. The most warning signs were practically blinding. The book Mein Kampf had been in widespread print for a decade, outlining exactly what the regime intended to do. The Nuremberg laws stripping citizens of their basic rights were official public policy. The militarization of German society was broadcast on global newsreels, yet foreign capital and technology continued to flow unimpeded. This was not a tragic accident or a massive intelligence failure. It was the global capitalist system functioning exactly as designed, prioritizing immediate shareholder value over the long-term survival of human lives. While multinational corporations provided the physical tools and the capital, elite Western politicians provided the crucial strategic space. The diplomatic policy of appeasement is often dismissed today as mere political cowardice or foolish naivete. In truth, it was a highly calculated, deeply cynical strategy of containment that failed spectacularly. We look at September 1938, the Munich Conference. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and French Premier Édouard Daladier fly to Germany for crisis negotiations. They deliberately do not invite the government of Czechoslovakia, even though the dismemberment of Czechoslovakian sovereign territory is the sole item on the agenda. The German dictator demands the immediate annexation of the Sudetenland, the heavily fortified, mountainous border region that serves as Czechoslovakia's main military line of defense against invasion. The British and French delegations, terrified of triggering another grinding trench war and desperate to direct German aggression eastward toward the Soviet Union, simply give it to him. They sign away another country's sovereign territory, bypassing the League of Nations entirely, to buy themselves time. Chamberlain flies back to London, stepping off the airplane, waving a piece of paper, famously declaring peace for our time. Historians often debate the actual utility of the Munich Agreement. Some modern revisionists argue Chamberlain was trapped by a weak military and was effectively buying crucial time for British rearmament programs to spin up. But the immediate concrete strategic cost of the betrayal at Munich was absolutely devastating. By handing over the Sudetenland without firing a single shot, the Western Allies effectively handed Germany the massive Skoda armament works, one of the largest and most advanced weapons manufacturing complexes in all of Europe. These massive industrial facilities fell into hostile hands completely intact, along with vast stockpiles of raw materials. When German panzer divisions rolled into France 2 years later, a highly significant percentage of their tanks and artillery pieces were built in Czech factories stolen at Munich. Appeasement was not just a diplomatic failure to read the room. It was a massive, flashing green light. It signaled definitively to a predatory dictator that the Western democracies lacked the political stomach for any real kinetic confrontation. Every single trap set by the victors of the last war was being systematically dismantled in broad daylight. First, the remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936, then the forced annexation of Austria in early 1938, then the Sudetenland later that same year. The Western democracies folded their hand every single time. They consistently mistook a temporary delay in hostilities for a permanent diplomatic solution. Yet, even with Western weakness totally exposed, a massive strategic obstacle remained on the board. The Soviet Union. A two-front war was the ultimate nightmare for German military planners. It had completely doomed the German Empire in 1914, bleeding their armies dry across thousands of miles. To strike decisively in the West, they needed absolute, guaranteed quiet in the East. This brings us to August 23, 1939 in Moscow. It is a moment of pure, staggering geopolitical whiplash. The two most aggressively ideological enemies on planet Earth sign a formal non-aggression pact. German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop and Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov shake hands for the cameras, while Joseph Stalin smiles approvingly in the background. For half a century after the war, the Soviet government violently suppressed the full truth of this meeting, flatly denying the existence of the secret protocols attached to the formal treaty. When historians and journalists finally accessed the Soviet archives after the collapse of the Berlin Wall in 1989, the historical reality was stark and undeniable. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was never just a temporary neutrality agreement. It was a highly detailed, cold-blooded blueprint for imperial conquest. The secret protocols literally divided Eastern Europe into specific spheres of influence. The text carved up the map, assigning the western half of Poland to Germany and the eastern half to the Soviet Union, along with handing the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, as well as parts of Romania, over to Soviet control. Stalin was playing his own deeply cynical, highly calculated game. He knew a final clash with Germany was likely inevitable in the long run, but he desperately wanted to watch the capitalist powers of Britain, France, and Germany bleed each other dry in a massive Western war of attrition first. By legally securing his western border and grabbing a massive territorial buffer zone, Stalin believed he was acting with cold, rational pragmatism. Instead, he made the invasion of Poland a mathematical certainty. Once the existential threat of a two-front war was officially eliminated by the pact, the final countdown to kinetic action began. There were no diplomatic hurdles left to clear. The global order had completely and totally collapsed. 7 days later, September 1, 1939, the ancient German training battleship Schleswig-Holstein opens fire on a small Polish military transit depot at Westerplatte in the early morning hours. The textbook narrative says this specific naval bombardment is the moment the war begins. But as we have systematically seen, this is merely the moment the massive, decades-long bill finally comes due. The staged explosion in Mukden in 1931 proved definitively that the League of Nations was a paper tiger unwilling to enforce its own laws. The deliberate economic ruin of the Versailles Treaty in 1919 provided the angry, radicalized foot soldiers desperate for a violent revival. Corporate executives in New York and London provided the vital synthetic fuel additives, the raw steel, the transport trucks, and the logistical data infrastructure. The elite diplomats at Munich cleared the strategic chessboard of all democratic obstacles. And the secret, late-night handshakes in Moscow sealed Poland's fate. September 1, 1939 is not the true origin point. It is simply the bloody climax of a 20-year systemic failure. It is the final, catastrophic payoff of thousands of small, calculated decisions made by men in expensive suits who arrogantly thought they could control a monster they actively helped feed. The resulting system cost tens of millions of human lives. Entire ancient cities were lost with all hands, reduced to burning rubble. A massive generation of young men and innocent civilians was fed into an industrial meat grinder, precisely because the international community repeatedly chose the path of least resistance. They chose quarterly corporate profit over collective global security. They chose temporary, optical political victories over long-term structural stability. They desperately believed their own diplomatic fictions, until the harsh reality of mechanized warfare shattered the illusion forever. This hidden history is absolutely vital because it strips away the highly comfortable myth of a sudden, unpredictable crisis. Wars on this massive scale do not just happen out of nowhere. They do not fall from the sky. They are meticulously built piece by piece, compromise by compromise, contract by contract. The true historical tragedy is not just that one dictator desperately wanted a war. The far greater tragedy is that the entire global apparatus of money and power bent over backwards to accommodate him, supply him, and excuse him until it was far too late to stop the machine. We study this gritty, uncomfortable history not to simply dwell on the terminal outcomes of the past, but to recognize the exact same mechanics operating in our world today. When you see modern multinational corporations prioritizing resource extraction and market access over basic human rights, you are seeing the exact same boardroom logic of the 1930s. When you watch major global powers completely ignore international law to carve up smaller, weaker neighboring states while the world watches, you are watching the exact same institutional cowardice that failed so miserably at Munich. The names of the politicians change, and the borders on the map shift, but the grim math of power remains exactly the same. If we do not understand how the system actually works, how raw power is quietly traded in secret protocols and closed-door meetings, we will remain completely blind to the next catastrophe until the artillery actually starts firing. The true origin of the last World War stands as a permanent warning about the extreme fragility of peace when the very institutions designed to protect it are hopelessly compromised by greed and political fear. We must ask ourselves what happens when modern demagogues start demanding their own Sudetenlands, and modern corporations stand fully ready to sell them the advanced technology they need to take it. We will explore exactly how post-war intelligence agencies immediately recruited the very individuals they just defeated to fight a brand new shadow war in our next investigation into the hidden history of the Cold War. Tell us in the comments below which major historical myth you want us to expose next. Do not forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an investigation into the true mechanics of global power.